Okay, so for our last session this afternoon in here, we're going to have a Q&A panel. We've got Steve Lee's joined. Do you want to join the panel, Steve?
That's right.
All right, okay. Well, I'm sure you've got answers anyway for stuff.
I'm sure we have.
Yeah, so you can pitch in. So yeah, we're having a Q&A panel representing some approaches to land stewardship. Sort of ways of working with and on the land, and various connecting areas of production, livelihood, sustainability, regeneration, and then the question of the human relationship within and of the land. And we recognise that this panel represents some approaches, and they're not the definitive knowledge of land management and stewardship. There's plenty of knowledge in this room, as has been demonstrated by people just walking in, and we hope to make space for answers within this room that might come up to questions that arise. And I just want to acknowledge that there are many voices not included here in this panel. So we've kind of got a majority white panel, and some may have accessed their skills through education or academia. And want to recognise that the vast majority of land workers in the world are not white, and permaculture itself has been criticised or critiqued for taking credit for practices that are developed outside of rich industrial nations. So we don't want to suggest here that modernity is saving the world with new ideas, but acknowledge a regenerative route forward maybe in the teachings, traditions and histories of people who have had their own access to land stolen. And so we want to just be able to reference those and to honour those teachings. And I also want to acknowledge the vast majority of agricultural workers in this country are not represented here, and that there are many different ways and routes and approaches. But for the purposes of having a structure to pin a conversation around, these fine people are willing to share their experiences of land stewardship, their successes and challenges. And I imagine there'll be questions that will emerge that you may have discussion amongst yourselves with ideas and thoughts. So yeah, we're going to open up for questions in the room of what might come up, but first of all I just want to ask the panel to just introduce themselves by giving their name and their pronouns so we can accurately refer to each other, and then what you do or what you have done, and the kind of methodology you're coming from, so that there's a sense of how to pitch the questions. Sorry, it's making quite a lot of beeping. So should we start from this end? Should we start with Alex?
Thank you. Hello, I'm Alex. I live in an off-grid eco-community called Tinker's Bubble. We run essentially as a workers' co-op where we, although that's not our legal structure, where we live on the land, make our livelihoods from the land. There's sort of two aspects to that I feel. One is the living on the land and living within the ecosystem. So we live in self-built houses in the woods. The materials for that come from the woods we live in. We grow vegetables, and so it's there's a kind of integration of our lives with the land that we're working. We also have two businesses that we run. One is a sustainable forestry business, and the other is an apple pressing and cider making business. Both of them are quite low intensity businesses because we grow our own food, live off grid, our overheads are quite low, so we're not having to work to sort of market demands. And that for me is part of the key of Tinker's Bubble, is that it allows us to be in a different kind of relationship with the land and our livelihoods. So it doesn't push us into a kind of extraction mindset or a profit mindset in the way that most land working people are kind of pushed into by our culture. Part of our ethos is that we don't use fossil fuels on the land, so it's a lot of hand tools. We use horses to extract logs and do some of the tillage. And so there's an intimacy there where we're not using sort of the industrial levels of energy input to manage the land. It's very kind of intimate in some ways. I think that's all I want to say now.
My name's Sagara Vajra, or Sagara for short.
I'd like to just give a bit of my sort of journey into what I'm doing before I describe what I'm doing. So about 20 years ago, I'd just been on a long retreat in Spain, and I came back and I was sort of looking to redefine myself. And my partner of the time, her father, had loads of books about, well, climate change and the environment. And I just thought, I want to get up to date with how things are at the present time. And as I read, I realised, wow, we are really, it was much worse than I had ever imagined. And I was just surprised because, like, in the media at that time, there was very little, being talked about in this realm. So I thought, wow, whatever I do next, it needs to be congruent to these issues. So there's not just climate change, there's loss of biodiversity may actually be more important, in terms of the longevity of the planet. And there's probably about 8 different issues: loss of topsoil, the eutrophication of waterways, loss of biodiversity, carbon dioxide and climate change, and all of those. And so then you're faced with what do I do in relation to all this massive problems? Do I just select one problem and deal with that for the rest of my life, or whatever? So anyway, I left those problems to the side, and then I got sort of interested in forest gardens. And just at that time, there were some amazing books that had been published about forest gardening. And as I read it, it suggested that forest gardens were a kind of a solution to all of these different problems. And so that's what really inspired me. I thought, by just doing this one thing, even though it's just me on a tiny little scale, I felt really important to live congruently to these issues, that my life was directly in relationship to these problems. And I sort of also wanted a really lyrical response to these issues, rather than feeling like really anxious. Was there a possibility to do something really kind of inspiring and lyrical? I guess, part of me's an artist, probably more than a grower. I'm more of an artist, maybe a thinker, or, and somewhat a grower as well. But it's like all those things together. And then about 12 years ago, we bought some land, not that far from here, about 12 miles from here, and it was a, exhausted horse paddock. And spent 2 years coming up with a design, and so now it's a forest. Probably the development work finished about in the spring of this year, and now there's the question of how we're going to live on this land. And I suppose part of me realises, looking at the problems, we've just got to live so differently to what we are, and I think there's scope for lots of different experiments for living differently. And the intriguing, or the thing that really intrigues me is the possibility, because we feel like we're living on paradise. We live on this piece of land where, like, more or less all our needs get met passively, and it's like we're in the perfect human niche. It feels like, to sort of, you get your Maslow's hierarchy of needs are all met in this space, and so it feels like paradise. And so we really like the idea of just creating paradise be the solution to the problems. So that's kind of where I'm situated, and moving forward from there. Whether we'll achieve that completely, I don't know, but we've achieved it, I think, at least to some extent. So I'll leave it there.
There's places like paradise, if you haven't been, I highly recommend it. So I'm Tasha. Thank you for that introduction. I'm a mixed race woman. My father's from Nicaragua in Central America, and I'm sort of one generation removed from peasant farming, and I'm finding it really touching as time kind of goes on and more people acknowledge the different lineages that this kind of work comes from. And because I think I'm lucky enough to sort of have a lot of stuff alive in me just from that lineage. So my grandfather is a forest gardener, and he employs at various points in the week up to 12 people on 4 acres and sells indigenous packed lunches. And so I've been very blessed to have that as just like my model. And I went on to have a cooperative style festival cafe. I lived at Tinker's Bubble with Rosie for some time. And then when I was selling food at Buddhafield, I served a billionaire, and was invited to be the leader of a very big land and, well, very big by my standards, it's 200 acres almost, land and food project just outside of Frome. And I primarily made my living from picking and selling sea buckthorn juice, which maybe some of you have had in the past. But my work now is very much transforming into wild tending and biomimicry. And I essentially cultivate wild foods, including wild strains of medicinal mushrooms. And part of that work is setting aims for the site, like providing up to 80% of our food from the land. Very much kind of always on the journey of how do we interrelate as human beings, and how can we reflect our care for nature, as in care for the environment, as well as each other as part of the environment. So that's the question that I've been really sat with, and I'm very lucky to be in a place where we're marrying a retreat centre and an agri-wilding site. So it's very much about the internal work as well as the external work, and it's in a setting where it's a wealthy place, and high-end retreats come through. And to begin with, I had a lot of judgment around what it meant to be working with the upper classes, and I have to admit that I've had to do a lot of learning about that as well, and a lot of kind of delayering of my preconceptions about what it meant to be wealthy, and the responsibility and the attitudes that held. So that's been my journey. We've just opened up a production space where we're going to be making and selling all of our preserves, and now we're very much looking at the issues facing the people that help to hold the space, including the cost of living and what that means to have a big site, and all the potential to create community, but in some cases none of them know how. So it's kind of going on that journey. I think that's it for now. I could talk forever about all those different avenues, but I don't know if should we do questions at the end?
I just wanted a definition of agri-wilding.
Okay, so Rebecca Hoskins was actually the woman that defined agri-wilding, and I have to say that I'm probably slightly left of her definition. Essentially, we have on our site a mixture of agriculture and rewilding happening in tandem, and so it's very much the school of thought that to produce food, nature is producing food abundantly all of the time, and actually the way that we can interact with nature can just be supporting nature to produce more food, or to be tending it and orientating it in certain ways. And we have, we're next to Ben Goldsmith, and we have beavers, we have European sea turtle, we have pine martins. So there's a rewilding aspect to the project, but we're doing agriculture in tandem with rewilding.
Hi. Okay, so my name's Naboo. While I'm at festivals, but out in the real world I'm called Tim. It's a bit of a letdown, isn't it? What amazing stories from amazing people. And so eloquent. Okay, so I'm fortunate enough to have 11 acre smallholding in North Devon. And I kind of came to that. I was an aircraft engineer, archaeologist, into countryside management. I worked at the Earth Centre, which was a very weird millennium environmental project up near Doncaster. I did some forestry, and eventually I came to a place where I felt that permaculture offered so many solutions to so many of the world's problems, and I just love that blend of being sort of all-encompassing and then bringing things down to a very small scale at the same time. I suspect, this is me making assumptions, I'm slightly odd in terms of being a permaculturalist, in that I don't really reject a lot of things that are used in conventional agriculture. So I quite like treated fence posts, and this is my big thing. God, I can say this, right? I quite like glyphosate. I quite like glyphosate in very small doses in very particular places. So I guess what I'm saying is I try not to have a dogma in the way I approach trying to do the best thing on the land. Whatever the best thing on the land is, then I'll sort of be open to all ideas, and most of the time that will be, saying no to intensive kind of stuff, or conventional farming kind of stuff. But sometimes, I'll be open to that, is what I'm saying. So my small holding is, say 11 acres. I planted up, it had an acre of woodland on it already. I planted up an extra 2.5 acres of that. The middle of it is all orchards, mostly apples. I have sheep, and my main focus at the moment is beekeeping. So I am, I've kept bees off and on for very many years. I've just got back into it, and my main sort of things that I'm into at the minute is developing insulated beehives that are a bit more like the inside of a tree. But I don't know, that's a good example, is the hives I'm making are made from like normal wood on the inside, and then I use recycled 2-inch polystyrene board outside that, and then I use stock board on the outside of that, which is like recycled silage wrap plastic. I quite like the use of the things that work, whatever it works, And I'm also trying to breed the native dark honeybee, which is better adapted to our British climate than the Mediterranean type of bees that a lot of beekeepers use. So that's sort of my main sort of project at the moment. I'll do. Thank you.
I'm Laura. Hello everyone. I am here representing rewilding. I work at Embercombe as their rewilder, and my background is a nature conservation professional, I guess. So I've worked managing nature reserves and designated spaces for biodiversity for about 25 years. And I've come to rewilding through nature conservation, nature reserve management, farm advice, natural flood management, and nature conservation grazing, extensive grazing of habitats. And so I think today I'm here to bring a rewilding perspective. And at Embercombe we are rewilding the land, which was previously being used for food production and timber production, pasture, various iterations over the years. And at present we are using rewilding principles as a management approach to the land, and how that sits with people in that landscape as well. I'm also, within that rewilding category, also looking at other forms of rewilding. So I think today we'll be talking mainly about rewilding the land, and how, for me, that represents the restoration of ecological systems in a way of trying to aspire to replace the natural processes and the animals and systems within our planet that have been removed from our landscape by humans, about how we can restore those, what proxies can we use in the absence of those genuine natural processes that we've removed. But at Embercombe we're also looking at how we might rewild ourselves. I don't particularly like that terminology, but I haven't yet come to a place of knowing what to say instead of it. So I may also represent here today
some of the rewilding approaches around the removal of domestication of humans and animals, and the dismantling of the structures that take us away from our place in the wild as well. So at Embercombe we're looking at
pitching the validity of one above the other, and that we're talking about relationships. This is land, this is humans, this is animals, and there are many ways of approaching it. So I'm just throwing that one in. So should we open up for questions? Does anyone have a burning one that... Yeah, go on. Let's start over there again.
Also, I just want to know, I know where Bubble is, but I don't know, you said North Devon, where in North Devon?
East Devon, so it's about
North East, right.
near Clumpton.
Yeah. Thanks. And the other places? Outside Frome?
42 acres is at Witham Priory, which is just outside Frome.
Okay. I live in Bath.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm the one that's been North Devon,
Oh, right, okay. Whereabouts then?
Barnstable way.
Okay, I used to live in Lee, just along from there.
Okay, great.
Hence the interest.
Yeah.
and Embercombe, it was in the Team Valley in Devon, so near, just outside Exeter.
I've been there, thank you.
Tinker's Bubble's in South Somerset.
Okay, grand. I think we had a question over here.
With climate breaking down and becoming more obvious, what do you see as being the biggest challenge to your approach or your role that you're in, and how do you think your role can best adapt or help the situation?
I can respond to the biggest challenge, and I'm going to make it up in the second bit. But so we, less than 2 weeks ago, we arrived on a Monday morning and we had a peat fire. So a camper had been kind of walking through, decided to have a campfire, and they hadn't been able to put it out, so it travelled down into the soil and it had started spreading. It had burnt for 3 days without anybody knowing. And I don't know if any of you have seen a peat fire, but it is like looking at kind of something from hell. It's like the ground is on fire. And I think, if I'm really honest, for me, it's been very clear that if land is to be really loved, part of it is to have human presence. And when human presence is only in the context of a working arrangement, as in it's only in the context of a paid job, then sometimes people go home at 5 p.m. and then they're not there anymore. And so it's twofold for me. It's access to land, as in advocating that we need to re-establish the human connection, care and deepest love for land in order to be responsive. And then it's educating around what that means to landholders that perhaps don't understand how damaging it is for people to be disconnected from land and to only be engaging with others in land work through the paradigm of a job.
I can offer two responses. One is I was just after the really hot weather, just before it turned, I was listening to the farming program about 6:30, whenever it is in the morning, and we get our water from a well, and the well had definitely been, the refresh rate was becoming lower and lower. So I've been starting to get a little bit concerned, and just we totally rely on it. So I was a little bit concerned, but on the farming program they were saying, well, this could go on for another 3 months or longer. And I thought, wow. So I just got in my car, went to the local agricultural supply and got a 5,000 litre tank. And then basically it was filling up with water within 2 hours. So, yeah, just sort of thought, now it's just sitting there with insurance, but as insurance for water. But since then it's been raining a lot, naturally. And the other response is what we're finding is like pollination is all over the place in the spring. So last year was late frosts happened, so lots of things didn't produce any fruit. And then most of those things have done really well this year, and other things have done really badly this year. So I think that sort wasn't like frost, but I think it's the pollinators are a bit confused, so they're not necessarily coming out at the time when the flowers are happening. But fortunately, I think the design of a forest garden means that you've got loads of diversity, and because they're perennial plants, I think we might have lost 1 or 2 plants this year, but okay, something doesn't produce this year, but it'll be different next year, and different things will fail, and different things will succeed. So I think just having that diversity is a good solution.
I'll add something. I think I could list many things that biodiversity will be impacted hugely, and you've both said, a couple of things that obviously drought, loss of pollinators, all those things. But I actually think that for rewilding, if I'm just thinking about rewilding as an approach, I think actually one of the biggest threats to rewilding is that it doesn't become established quickly enough in time, that the effects of climate change become so powerful that there is a human clamour to control all of those changes that are happening. And part of I should have said in my introduction that there are many different definitions of rewilding, so I'm bringing my own today. I'm not necessarily saying that I represent everyone's version of rewilding. But one of the sort of, if you like, big picture things of rewilding is about letting natural processes take place. And if we took the fire, for example, was actually, can we allow those natural processes to take place when we live in such proximity to humans? So, for example, if we had a fire at Embercombe, if we were truly rewilding, we would let that fire run through. And
the fire was human caused.
Yeah, of course, in your example it was. But if that could be a proxy for it happening naturally, in the absence of those things that cause fire naturally that we've pushed out of our landscape. So, and I worry that the pressure of climate change and the need to people they want to find a technological solution to that will not allow us to rewild properly or fully before we feel the need to also control that part of it as well. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but and what I think rewilding can bring is the second part of your question, is possibly to, if we can, learn to embrace change and zoom out on our landscape. So we're not just all looking at individual sites, but looking at a landscape. So from a biodiversity point of view, an owl doesn't mind whether it crosses my fence into somebody else's, but their management may be very different from mine. So maybe climate change can teach us to zoom out, or rewilding can teach us to zoom out, and that may help us to provide solutions that can help in the climate. I'm not going to say the fight against climate change, because I don't feel that makes it seem like it's an other, whereas actually it's part of what we're doing in the first place. So, but rewilding has the potential to help sequester carbon and increase biodiversity and all those other things, which will help us diminish the losses that we're making.
Have we got another question in the room?
Oh, I might add, sorry,
Yeah, go on.
Alice wanted to say. Right. I was just wanting to add what Sagra was saying. To cut a long story short, I've at the similar time to Sagra, I tried to establish a forest garden at my place. In a lot of ways, it didn't work out, but I've learned from that, and I've applied a lot of forest garden principles to the rest of the site. So, like making my orchards a bit more like a forest garden, for example. And I think it's quite interesting that despite the massive heat we've had and that long dry spell, similarly, hardly lost any plants because they're all perennials. I find it interesting applying the thing that that you can have if you've got a piece of land that's being grazed, it can actually be more productive if you've got a lot of tree cover on it, because you can have quite a few trees before you impact the the amount of production you get out of the grazing, because you're causing a lot less stress to the sward. So you could literally see underneath the apple trees this greener area underneath the tree compared to the bit that's in the full sun, so you can create this much more resilient habitat. And I think that one of the main things that sort of pop into my head is how do we get away from a ploughing-based agriculture? Ever since humanity discovered the plough, everywhere the plough's been, it's destroyed the environment. Now, I love my crunchy nut cornflakes as much as the next man, but crunchy nut cornflakes with nuts on. Right, well, crunchy nut cornflakes with nuts on. I mean, there we go, perennials. Anyway, but we need to, reduce and really be careful about how we plough the land, if we have to plough the land, and try and get away from that as far as possible. And I guess I just wanted to come back to what I said in my bit of the introduction was I would rather be producing food using perennial plants with a bit of chemical input than I would producing food from a ploughing system that was organic. I think actually the perennial system with a bit of chemical in it is more environmentally friendly and more sustainable than the ploughing, if that makes sense. So.
So we had one at the back, and then we'll go to the back there, and then we'll come back.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what kind of plants would you suggest to plant in a woodland zone for eating edible plants? Especially vegetables.
Like what's what?
As opposed to obviously maybe fruit bushes, strawberries, but more vegetable type.
Yeah, I mean that's not necessarily something I've got experience with, because the nature of a forest garden is probably more like a savanna, in the sense that you've got quite a lot of glades and open space. So anyway, you have shady. There are some shady plants that will grow, but they're relatively few and far between. I'm just trying to think of, like, there's one called a plum yew, which grows in complete shade and that produces the fruit. Things like hostas, a really lovely vegetable, they'll grow in shade. Offshoots, there's something called Aralia cordata, which is a sort of an asparagus substitute, which isn't complete shade, but it's semi-shade. That would be a good option. Some ornamental rhubarbs, don't mind a bit of shade. That's things off the top of my head, but you can probably find there'll be a list somewhere of, shade-loving perennial plants. But those are the ones that are on the top of my head.
There's a fern.
Yeah. Ferns or something. Ostrich fern.
Ostrich fern.
Yeah.
It loves shade. You can't plant it anywhere else.
It's true.
Yeah.
And that's lovely shoots.
Shoots, yeah.
But you shouldn't eat any other sort of ferns because they're poisonous.
Any more on that one? Or should we go to the next question? At the back there. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you'll have insight into this, but permaculture is obviously still more of a fringe sort of practice. But with things like climate change and the sort of biodiversity collapse which this country is witnessing, what are you seeing from more conventional farming practices of a desire to take up more of these principles? Are more large-scale conventional farmers approaching your projects, or are you hearing about that in the landscape and saying, oh, maybe actually you're onto something, or are they still quite resistant to it?
Yeah, I've got an anecdote about that. When I first arrived on my bit of land, the next door farmers hardcore agriculture. I mean, their bit of land is about 2 feet lower than mine, from the loss of the topsoil, which is interesting. And when I first went there, he was, I think, intrigued initially, and then he did a bit of work for me. We sort of gone, okay, and then I did these earthworks to create warm microclimates and outdoor living rooms. And so in his eyes, I'd completely ruined an agricultural field. And then he just blanked me for the next, 6, 7, 8 years. And, that's happened. So we just let it go. And then I was walking with my partner last spring. We were just walking around the field, and he was in his field right next door. And he called over and he said, I'm coming over to your side, he said. We're going to transition to organic. And he said it in such a way, sort of seeking an approval, which is kind of total reverse of relationship. And so he was going to plant red clover to transition to be organic. But subsequently, that's not happened. It's two crops of wheat. But at least it's obviously on his mind, and he's what we've done has impacted on him. But I suspect why he's doing it is more for financial reasons than, I think there's subsidies or whatever for being like that, rather than because he believes in it. That's my impression.
I think there is somewhere on the internet you can. There are people out there who search the number of searches, record the number of searches for different terminology. And I spoke to somebody a couple of years ago who worked for Farmers Weekly, and they have people monitoring which words people are searching for to do with farming. And the searching for regenerative agriculture is like exponentially increasing. I think that for what we would call large-scale farmers, who we might consider to be doing intensive agriculture, they are going to be looking to some of the really big farmers that have converted over to regenerative agriculture first before they come to small-scale places, because they need to find somebody who they can relate to that runs a similar system to them and uses the same language, the same equipment, the same tools, the same margins, and I mean profit margins, not field margins. And so there are some really big intensive farmers who have switched over to regenerative agriculture. And there's a big difference between a regenerative agriculture field on a large scale that might be intercropping, minimum till or no till. That's very different from somebody who is running a forest garden or permaculture garden or a rewilding estate. And so those farmers who are looking to transition, who maybe it's coming into their awareness of the damage, or maybe it's financially motivated, they will look to these really big regenerative farmers who are able to prove or to show, or who are working to show, that the margins are not affected by letting go of some of those more harming practices. So it's unlikely that large-scale farmers would come to a small-scale farmer for advice. So we need people across the board who are, working to perhaps still farm thousands of acres, but in a regenerative way, so that they can talk the language of these farmers who have a much bigger operation. And there are some out there that are doing that. There are some really big farmers that are doing that, and those numbers are going up. I know at NEP, which is obviously the sort of big rewilding estate in Sussex, which lots of you have probably heard of, they have also now got a regenerative agriculture area. So they're working to sort of talk to other farmers about that. So it's not only rewilding or only intensive agriculture, there is something in between. And there's a big rewilding estate up in Norfolk Wild Pen Hill, and their estate is actually divided into 3 zones, and they have a regenerative agriculture, a rewilding, and a sort of making space for nature, somewhere in between. So these are the types of estates that those big farmers will go to for advice, so that they can look at their profit margins and their equipment.
Can I just go?
Yeah, part of the change I'm seeing is a political change as well. So I think there can be a story in the alternative world that we're trying to do something good and what's conventional isn't. But actually, people working the land want to care for the land, and the reason we have really high stocking rates and extractive agriculture is because the market's pushed that and the margins have pushed that, and that's what people have to do to stay on the land in that context. So one of the effects of leaving leaving EU has been that we're changing how the subsidies are working for land work. And there's a trial going on now with the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is going to be how land subsidies work. And there's quite a change in how that's framed. It's looking a lot more at a kind of integration of environmental benefits with land work. And so it feels quite exciting to me to see what that policy is trying to do, and also where it's coming from, where the advice is coming from, and some of these sort of what have been fringe perspectives being more included. So hopefully that, if money is available to support that kind of thing, it kind of frees up our energy to do what we want to be doing, which is caring for the land.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I'm in a bit of a funny position. I always feel like I'm somewhere in between. So when I come to a field like this, I feel like I'm the straight one. And then when I'm talking to the farmers around me, I feel like I'm the weirdo, right? I find it quite interesting how, open-minded it's possible for conventional farmers to be. I get a bit more of an insight because my missus, she's a large animal vet as well, so I get stories from her. But I went on a one-day course a few years ago where it was about it was a sheep farmers, conventional sheep farmers turned up on this guy's place, and what he was doing was he was planting a very diverse sward, right, in his fields for his sheep, with like lots of chicory, sort of like medicinal stuff and nutritional stuff, which wouldn't have been dreamt of a few years ago. And also they were putting in like massive new hedge banks, right? Not taking the hedges out, they're putting these massive hedge banks with hybrid poplars planted on top to make these massive windbreaks to reduce the amount of environmental stress on the sheep. Because when it's really windy, that kind of puts stress on the animals, and then the sheep aren't as productive. So, these are sort of very sort of permaculture kind of things, and there they are with all these conventional farmers with the quad bikes and the big tractors and massive machines and that, and there's that meeting in between of something that's come from the kind of alternative permaculturally kind of sphere. And the other thing was mob grazing. Yeah, so where you get your paddocks, so you get your big fields and you divide them into very small paddocks, and you have the sheep grazing it for a very short time, very intensively. To cut long story short, it builds up the soil carbon, and you can actually have a higher stocking density. But they were kind of just opening up to this, and in parts of New Zealand, it's like, well, if you're not doing that, this is like conventional New Zealanders, right? If you're not doing that, what are you doing? So.
I wonder if Steve wants to say anything about that.
Possibly. I think when I started farming, 40 cows provided a good living. Mm. Now, I think people are being forced, and they're more like mice in a wheel, they're having to run to keep up with the costs surrounding them. That's why a lot of people have got bigger, and I know several bigger 600 cow herds, organic, but they're having to put so much in it, mentally and physically. I think, they're in danger of burning themselves out.
And for those people, what's the sense of an alternative? Is that changing?
Well, the government grants and the way they shifted farming, they changed. They didn't want, the old cowshed system. They said we should have cubicles. This was better and so on. That created slurry, and then there's been a problem then with what to do, how to handle the muck. So this involves lots of machinery, so you can't get away, from going for simple farming without involving a lot of machinery. But one question I would like to ask you is Tinker's Bubble. How many acres do you have, and how many people does it support?
So it's 40 acres, and just over half of that's coniferous woodland.
Yeah.
We've got 6 people living there at the moment, but the planning permission, we sort of justified a maximum of 16 adults based on how much money we could earn from the land sustainably. And my sense is the way that we do agriculture there, we could have a lot more people. That part of the beauty of what we do at the Bubble is by not using fossil fuels, it's human input that's so important. So actually having a lot of people there means that we can manage the land more productively, whereas the commercial pressures in larger scale farming means that it's kind of production per land area. What am I trying to say? It kind of changes the equation. So Tinker's Bubble, I think, could support more people if we use the land slightly differently, but at the setup at the moment, that's how it is.
That's what would worry me, is that, how much land we would require to support the number of people that we have to support throughout the country.
Yeah, and I think what we see is that if we're farming with that intensity of human input, the actual production per unit area is higher than in monocultures because we can take care at that level. But it kind of raises the question for me of what is the balance of that kind of intensity of growing our own vegetables alongside large-scale monoculture. So our wheat for our bread still comes from monocultures from Europe mostly. And so there's things we buy in. And I think for me that finding that balance and knowing what we're doing with that balance is really important.
Is there more to say on that, or should we take another?
I just wanted to just go back a step about, and it was interesting you saying about 40 cows was a good living. I think it's also really important to remember that we often talk about the farmers, and I think those motivations. Farmers were paid not that long ago to remove all their hedgerows, make their fields bigger, put their animals in cubicles, and so it's important that we don't put them over there in a category of people that have chosen to do all this damage to the countryside, and then they've been moved through a system, as you pointed out, of those pressures to then have to keep bringing in those margins. So I think there's every spectrum of type of person trying to manage land in all different ways, from both scale and intensity, and some of those people might not feel entirely comfortable with it, but be stuck into a situation where they're investing each year in large, massive sums of money and can't get out of it. And now, they're being told they should put all their hedgerows back and plant fruit trees. So it's, these things are often driven by government policy, and so how that comes around, and the tests and trials that you're talking about with the environmental land system is one of those ways that policy is sort of swinging back round again. So I think it's just important to remember that when we're talking about farmers.
Yeah, thank you. And I suppose the pressures of when we're talking about livelihood, when we can set some projects up that are funded in particular ways, but then we're talking about livelihood from the land. How there are pressures in that if there isn't a kind of pocket of money that's funding a particular route of tending it in that way. So yeah, there's privilege in being able to rest on knowing that you're doing a particular thing when that money's there.
The single farm payment is gradually being abolished, and in these grants, environmental grants, are supposed to take place. Now here we put in several hundred yards of creating new earth banks, and they've been fenced and they've been planted with hedgerow, native species. Now, I can tell you that despite the fact that we've had grants for doing this, and also, we've had money for recycling the soil in this way, we haven't made any money out of it. In fact, by the time we've paid for it, even now the cost of diesel going up is tremendously ridiculous. But we haven't made any money, so we're losing the single farm payment. This is supposed to be replaced pound for pound these environmental grants. But to us, put it crudely, it's a bit of a con really, because we're not going to earn the money that we did before. So I'm very worried about how the farming will go. And they'll say, no, we in our family never supported Brexit. I feel that it was the worst thing that happened, particularly in our sphere.
And I think there's something in there, if I may, there's something in there as well about this, farming, again, it's a huge swathe of people, but there's this, you have my sympathy in the sense that there's this expectation that you should do that because you're a farmer, and that you should just get the cost. So you might have, the whips and the fence might have got paid for, but none of the labour, for example, or whichever way around, you balance it. And, there's a history of farmers being under-resourced, underpaid, not making a profit. And that is being perpetuated through the continuation of this grant fund. And then that in turn is reflected in the price that we pay in the shops for the food, which is undervalued, and the farmer doesn't, the farmer or the grower or the producer, whatever you want to call them, isn't getting any profit. In fact, sometimes it's at their loss. And there's a historical sort of echo going back that your time isn't paid for, so therefore you should just plant those hedges because it's the right thing to do, or because you're the land steward. So I think it's a really complicated and nuanced picture for the economics of farmers right up and down the scale, and I think the government have always said that these new payments will not replace single payment, they will be instead of, and so it's another form of austerity essentially to remove those payments.
In simple terms, we are not going to be able to reinvest in maintenance of the farm to grow crops. So there's going to be a gradual reduction of what we grow. I'm hearing about farmers now, with the cost of fertiliser and seed and diesel, they are not going to plant crops. All right, so that rewild it, but that flood is not going to feed the vast millions of people who are needed to be fed. I have a question for you. Net estate. How much percentage of the net estate has been turned over to rewilding?
So just pause a sec. We're going to take that question, and then we're going to come to you with the hat, and then we're going to come to you over there. I think you had your hand up. So we'll do that question.
Yeah.
And then
I don't know the facts and figures for NEP. I know the sort of general story is that they took the vast majority of their estate and split it into two halves. One half was fenced initially, and then the other bit came a few years later, and that was off the top of my head, maybe 15 to 20 years ago. I know that they are now doing a lot of partnership work with other farmers who are neighbouring them, so I'm not sure if some of their regenerative work is on neighbouring farms or whether it's on, I know it's not in the original rewilded area, but whether they had some other bits of their land that they didn't put into the wilding, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think they're branching out, they're growing veg within the estate. I know they're working with other landowners and working to create a corridor now down to the sea from NEP of getting other landowners on board to either rewild or make space for nature in some way. So I don't know the facts and figures, but I'm sure it's probably all on their info, on their bump on their website.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go to the question in the hat.
I actually wanted to answer Ben and give him a bit more of a detailed answer on what Leicestershire are doing at the moment.
Okay, yeah.
Out at Stamford Hall.
Let's hear that.
I'll sort of try and project a little bit that way. So Stamford Hall, it's a 1,000-acre estate. They just literally had the Leicestershire Food Summit going back earlier this year, which invited councillors, educators, food bank workers, all the various places in society within Leicestershire that are working on the front line of it. So all of these people getting involved shows that there is activity on the ground at the same time as a 1,000-acre estate, which is super aristocratic, right? I mean, you're talking the history of that place. But the guy who stewards the land at the moment, his ancestor killed Richard III. Yeah, like this is like mega. Yeah, like they're on the top. They're leading the way. They're wanting to see it happen. He's using the elm schemes to high level of advantage. So teaming up with people like Wild Farms, who are doing the wild grain growing using agroforestry belts in between and stuff, and the ARM schemes are providing money for people wanting to put these systems into their land. The money's available for it. For tree planting, for the agroforestry, all covered by the ALM schemes. It's just, unfortunately, the alienation of information is actually probably one of the biggest barriers around that. And because they are leading that way, and Nick is very much in their bigger circles, a lot of the big landowners and estate owners around Leicestershire want to get involved, primarily because the councillors, the educators, see the crisis in which you're sort of highlighting in what you're saying around farmers not being able to afford things. But knowing that there are solutions on the ground, I'm feeling pretty hopeful.
What scheme?
The ELM schemes. Yeah, they're environmental dimensions.
This is properly formulated, yeah.
No, not if, but the way that it's being trialled at Stanford Hall, and that's why they're like, he's really hashing it with them. Having conversations with the guys at DEFRA. So the CSA that's at Stanford Hall, the members of the Land Workers Alliance who are absolutely spearheading, pushing DEFRA to the absolute, in their heavyweight plan, right? So.
Thank you. So, did you want to say anything on that, or should we take another question? Grant, yeah. Yeah, let's go to you.
My question is more about the human relationships required to steward land. I'm coming from a very different context. I live in British Columbia. My family and I have 4 acres. All my grandparents were farmers in India, from Punjab, where a lot of the farmers' protests were happening. So farming is like in my blood. But what I'm encountering is that a lot of the examples I've seen around the world, and I actually looked up 42 acres before I came here, and I was really intrigued by it because that seemed really exciting to me that like billionaires could support some of these kinds of things, and there could be this kind of transfer of power and money to support really great food and really great community building. But what I've also seen is that there's a lot of eco-villages that are very insular, so that it's kind of inwardly focused. And then there are projects that are also integrated into wider communities like a town, a city, or providing tourism. And so I'm trying to find a balance between those two, and I want to have a retreat center and a flower and herbal garden, sustain people long-term housing on the land. But I'm just learning right now. So my question is, what helped you with conflict resolution, with the human relationships on the land? What are some of those communication, what helped you have better human relationships on the land with other humans?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
It's interesting listening to us because if I answer that question from a personal perspective, what's helped me a lot is getting very, very real about why I do what I do, and not hiding the spiritual aspect. Because I spent, so I worked for the Land Workers Alliance. I was the first regional coordinator, and also lived at Tinker's Bubble. And I didn't realise, but I spent quite a lot of time hiding feminine power. I must be strong. I must grow loads of things and produce loads of things, and lots of kind of just suck it up and get on with it. And actually, I was married for 10 years and my relationship fell apart, and as a result I lost land, and I kind of had a bit of a breakdown during that time. But for me it was a really important part of my process, because what it got me to do was to look very, very deep inside and kind of see what was already there, and that's coming from a place of love. And what I realised is that I didn't know how to love myself. I didn't really know how to love others, and I didn't know how to show up to land in a loving way consistently, because I was burning out, or because I was over exerting. So if I'm honest with you, and this is where it's quite funny to kind of come back round to being involved with Buddhafield or whatever, is because one of the criticisms I hear about spiritual work is that it's not, just get up and do stuff, stop just sitting on the cushion or whatever. But actually I'm get on the freaking cushion, because until you know how, like, what the cosmos is inside yourself, how can you how can you cultivate the tools you need to be a kind, loving human being? Like, you can't. And actually sustaining long-term relationships on land whilst doing pioneering work, whilst coming up against challenges of fire or money or, bureaucracy, freaking planning permission. Like, how are you going to manage that if you can't manage relationships? You just don't. And so for me, it's been the combination of the two that I now feel like I can, I think a lot of us, and I've only just realised these things, but like a lot of people that are interested in agroecology are highly sensitive people. And actually, the longer I've been helping to hold 42 acres, people turn up and they start melting down because we're on the edge of it all, really there. We're really on the edge of many different walks of life, yeah? We're like a crossroads. And so they come and they're like, oh my God, I have to do so well in order to like show up to this project. And all their crap just starts coming up. And I just sit there and I'm like, your sensitivity is a superpower. Just like, let it happen. Let the breakdown happen, because it's kind of, we spend so long trying to be like, I don't know, sorted or together or whatever it is. That's our Western society is so focused on productivity. And actually it's kind of, for me, it's like sitting on the land and being like, I have no idea what to do about this thing. And letting that unfold and just keep showing up in kindness.
I'd like to say, I think there's just room for every different approach. People like to be insular. They may come up with something that really affects the world in a way that you can never predict what's really going to make a difference, I don't think. And I think there's also a principle of showing your goal too soon, maybe sort of going out teaching your mistakes rather than your finely honed wisdom. So I think working on the land, it's quite a long time frame sort of process, and it takes a long time to learn skills which are hopefully helpful to other people. So that's kind of my feeling.
Yeah, I want to pick up on Tash. What you were saying is really beautiful and powerful, and I really appreciate that. And for me, it's something about having come to land work from sitting on the cushion quite a lot. Of the shift that's happened for me is that work you're talking about isn't happening just for myself or just for the other humans around me. It's happening in the context of the ecology I live within, and the land I live within. And so what helps me, and I do really struggle at times, but what helps me keep going is seeing that bigger picture that I'm participating within, that enables me to step back when I need to and care for myself when I need to, but also gives me a context to be in relationship with, and so I'm less isolated and tight and having to do it myself in opposition to the people or the bureaucracies or the whatever. So there's a learning to be with, to work with, and a humility there.
Something I think's interesting about where I've ended up. So I effectively, I own the 11 acres with my missus, and for a long time, I was like looking at sort of doing stuff with other people in a community, some sort of together cooperative thing, whatever it was, and I just saw lots of people really struggling to work together, and I just thought, this is really sad, right? But I'm just going to have to have my little plot that I do my thing on. I kind of hate it, right? I mean, I love it, I love doing it, but I really, I really wish I had, back then, I wish I could have figured out a way of doing it that was, I just saw so many groups that were just like trying to do it and then failing. I'm just like, I haven't got the energy for that, And I think that's really sad, because it's what the world is, our Western world, but it's kind of where's what it's done to us, I think. So having done that, every so often I'll try and put feelers out and say, does anybody want to come and share what I've got? And I never really get any responses. It might be because people hate me, or it might be because, you know, we don't live on the site. We live, you know, ex-council house a mile or two away. We're in North Devon. It's beautiful, and so everywhere is really expensive to live, or a holiday let, or a second home, you know. And so even if people wanted to come and take advantage of it, it's like, well, where are they going to live, you know? So I find that really quite sad, right? And the other side of it was in terms of my sort of personal relationship with the land, on what goes on there is something kind of brings joy into my heart and sort of despair at the same time. Is if I cycle in the summer, you know, a mile or so from my house, I'm going through this beautiful Devon countryside down a bridle path, right? It's beautiful, right? And there's like the fields and everything, blah blah. And then it's kind of like something missing, right? And then I get to this a little plot, and it used to be just 2 fields on quite a steep hill. I've planted 3,000 trees there, let's say, and let a lot of it go wild. And you know, park my push bike, and it's like, what's that? Oh God, insects! There's like the sound of so many insects. This is, you know, ignoring the fact, you know, I've started keeping the bees again this year, but for the last few years, you know, everything's grown up, and there's all this sort of life, you know. Even though the landscape looks beautiful around me, it's still like little strips of trimmed hedge with this sort of semi-monoculture of grazing grass in between and stuff, and so you know, and then alongside that, I say, especially being able to keep bees again. I was saying to some people yesterday, the privilege of being able to, you know, whether it's working with apples or with the woods or with the sheep or whatever it is, but especially with me bees, is, you know, you've got this box, right? It's 1.5 foot square, right? It's got these thousands of little creatures in it, and they're there because of going out 1.5 miles in all directions, and they've distilled the landscape into this box. It's there, like, in this box. And I have the privilege of being able to take the lid off this box and go in and interact with these bizarre alien beings, alright? I mean, they're like the most sort of, they're like just robots, and they're the most amazing creatures at the same time. They're like individual bees, but they're irrelevant. There's like this super organism made out of thousands of creatures, and they're all acting as one, and it's all in this box. And it's being able to have that relationship with something that, you know, it's just so different from yourself. It sort of, it really sort of expands your horizons, and you sort of means of connecting, you know, with Gaia, nature, whatever.
Thank you, Tim. So we're going to take a question from Jason, because I've missed you out a couple of rounds, so let's hear from you.
Me and another guy in the community that I live in have grown 1/2 acre of April bearded wheat this year, heritage variety, and we're completely winging it. We don't know what we're doing. We're crossing bridges as we come to them. At the moment, it's in a rick. We don't even know how we're going to thresh it. But and we were fortunate to have this friend. He had some pigs, so we were able to. The land was already cultivated, so we were able to plant it without too much difficulty. But you know, already now the land is covered with all sorts of plants growing in it. You know, because we're not using chemicals and things. And it's I really want to do it regeneratively, and I want to minimise cultivation, and I just haven't got a clue really how to do it. Does anybody know? You're right, not going.
I don't have an answer to your particular question, but I suppose the general frame of any farming, in a way, is we're negotiating with succession. You know, if we leave any bit of land for long enough, it becomes forest. And most of the food we like to grow is right at the beginning phases of succession. And to correct that, to grow things at that stage requires huge perturbations of the land. So that kind of goes with the territory, but there's different ways to correct that perturbation. And it's not something I'm particularly familiar with, but you could maybe use MyPet, but then you're using loads of plastic, for instance, or you mentioned pigs before, maybe that's the solution. But just to add, you know, so the system that we've adopted is to let succession unfold to a mid-succession forest. And at that stage, there are still maybe perturbations you make, but they may be cutting the limbs off a branch occasionally. And so there's much less, you're not damaging the soil. And a forest has twice the bioproductivity of agricultural land. Doesn't mean you get twice the food, but I think that bioproductivity also services the animals, so on and so forth. So in our way of thinking, to transform our food sources to a mid-succession forest means you're getting all the benefits of forests and you're still getting a food supply. So that's what we're trying to do, but you know, it requires a huge shift in our diet, and you know, we've not 100% done that. But
so you're saying just don't grow cereals at scale?
I'm not saying that. I'm choosing to do that. I don't want to say that you shouldn't do it. But I mean, maybe there are trials going with perennial grains, for instance, and so that might be. Hopefully, that will be something that gets developed. In which case, then that's cool. Or there are substitutes, like in forest gardening, like for instance, sweet chestnuts as a source of that you could make flour, and then it's being produced on a tree rather than at that early stage of succession. Anyway, I just thought I'd introduce that principle to understand that with every system you choose, it's got repercussions in terms of how we negotiate with the environment.
At an annual level, I haven't grown cereals, but I've seen much more work being done on trialling intercropping and having cover crops. So I was really struck, last year I was walking through a cereals field, and I think it was undersown with chamomile. And partly that does the job of weed suppression, but also there's a beauty and a biodiversity impact in that, and clovers can be used in different ways as well. So there's more work being done on trialling these things.
Yeah, just to add to what you were saying, I think maybe an invitation from a wildlife point of view, or from a, not wildlife, I would be looking at it from a natural process point of view. And you're rightly pointing out that you are trying to hold the land right at the beginning of that process of succession. So I don't know what the answer is, but maybe an invitation to think about what would be happening in a natural system that creates that early stage. And, you know, pigs is one, fire is another, you know, large grazing herbivores. And is there a way that you can invite that into your system so that you aren't using chemicals or machinery to do that? And I don't know if, you know, that exists, or whether that's maybe doing it in a big plot doesn't work. You have to rotate it round. So what is the natural, from a rewilding point of view, my thought process would be, what is the natural process that would create that environment, and what can I use as a proxy to mimic that, so that I can take advantage of that early stage of succession over and over again. Now, that then tells me that you need some sort of rotation, otherwise you'd be inviting problems with that process as well. But yeah, what is it you're trying to mimic, I guess, would be where I start thinking about it.
Some people would say that, you know, farming at that level, it's a bit like mining the soil, you know, it's extractive mining to grow our food. I don't know if that's true because I've never done it, but, you know, maybe that's one way you could look at it.
Sorry, to cultivate the soil over and over again, or something.
Yeah. So basically the soil's being used up to
I see, yeah.
Because like what creates topsoil is forests. It's all the leaf litter and the organic matter and so on, and the layering of those processes over time. And then we chop down the forest, and then over time we start to use it up. And I suppose that's what regenerative means. How do we keep that cycle going without forest? Because in the natural scheme of things, it's forest that creates the soil. So that's the dilemma kind of we're in. And I think there are, you know, you were talking about the sheep, for instance. That may be a way to do it. And maybe that's what happens on the prairies, I think. So it's kind of from a different ecological system, I think, that's intensive grazing. Maybe.
You can help.
Sorry?
Maybe you can help maintain this initial fertility without raising animals.
Yeah.
Sheep particularly. Yeah. So if you want to maintain that humus, organic material, that's probably the best way to do it. You know, not all land, very many of that is just not suitable for growing cereals. You know, which is why the sheep and the cattle provide the useful alternative. You know, particularly in an area like the southwest, with high rainfall, steep fields, stones, it's all suitable for raising animals. And the last one I might put in here is it's another way of using grass. I know probably a lot of you are vegetarians, but it's a way of turning grass through a sheep, which is meat. So you're only one stage away from just eating the grass yourself.
What's the you're going to open up that debate?
Did you want to follow on to that question with the?
Yeah. So what I was wondering is, I'd investigate your objectives and your motivation towards this, like, because you got this like a heritage oat, is that right?
Wheat.
Wheat. Okay, so you got this heritage wheat. So I guess I haven't got any direct experience of this, but I'm very interested in orchards. I do stuff with Orchards Live up in North Devon, and I do a course every year on planning your orchard. All right, and what we try and do is get people who haven't got an orchard to come along and learn about stuff and then plant an orchard. But what they tend to do is plant an orchard and then come on the course, which is a disaster. But anyway, so the point is people come along and go, oh, I want to have an orchard. It's like, why do you want an orchard? What's the point of your orchard? Is it because it's just like something that's pretty, that you feel this pressure to do something that's sort of a bit eco and a bit oldie worldy or something, or actually you're trying to grow apples to eat. I mean, you're actually trying to grow apples to eat. So people come and say, oh, I want to have peas good nonsuch and slack McGirdle, whatever. What do you want? Well, I like the name. I mean, it's an old variety. Well, okay, so how about you just pick apples that you like or that taste of? Because surely the important thing is that they taste nice. Or why do you want that heritage variety? Oh, it's an old variety. Okay, so people have put a lot of effort into breeding modern varieties, right? People have bred those modern varieties because the old varieties didn't taste very nice, So sometimes the old varieties are brilliant, they're sort of, you don't need to spray them with chemicals or whatever it is. It's like whatever, Ashmead's kernel or something like that. It's brilliant old, slightly older apple. But then there's other ones which are modern ones, which also don't need chemicals, and they've been bred to taste good. Is there some sort of irrational attachment because it's a heritage variety? Now there might be a perfectly good reason why you want to do it, and then great. But make sure you've got a reason, is what I'm saying. And I want to plough this field and grow oats rather than a forest garden. Okay, so why is that? And if you've got a good reason, great, but have a good reason, is what I'm saying.
Thank you. I'm loving this variety of answers. It's great. I think we've got time for one more question because we're coming up to the end. And we had a hand at the back. Did you want to ask one?
Maybe you had a hand.
I guess I'm trying to work exactly what the question is, but something to do with being part of lots of like land projects and community projects, whether they're big communities or smaller families, and through something that I do a lot, which is doing music and trying to bridge those worlds of it and bring those kind of musicians that want to support these land spaces, and I guess trying to like explore how we can do that, and for me it's really interesting, like hybrid space between like maybe the bigger contemporary festivals and the land projects, like the Land Workers Alliance, like the Land Skills Fair, or the farm hacks that we hosted one of Harder this year, in terms of where Tollhouse Organics is. And these like amazing kind of in-between spaces that are a mix of these like communities and these land projects, and have a lot of those essence of like maybe the more spiritual inner work as well, and maybe the the skills that we need in terms of like remembering and practicing how to work together as humans and with the land, and all of those kind of things mixing together, and also inspiring the people that maybe are more ready to come into these worlds, and how to welcome them in, and also like inspiring each other. And I guess for me that's a really exciting like place in the middle. Like what is that amazing space that we can co-create in, and what does that look like? And I guess for me it's a question more personal, is like how could we help, for example, as artists and musicians come to the land spaces, and what would it be that you would want or need, that we can bring?
Joy.
Yeah.
I think it's very easy to get super serious about this work, and we take ourselves very, very seriously. And I think music, I live with a musician, and I think music is so amazingly joyful and healing. You're talking about the in-betweeny spaces. I love those spaces. I think coming together as temporary communities gives us a chance to practice those skills without the intensity of living in community 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We, like at 42 Acres, we are running working retreats. I'm running one on Tuesday. We run one every week where people can come for free, and we do knowledge exchange. So these ones are all to do with outdoor mushroom growing. And we set it up in a gentle retreat context. So we do a little bit of meditation, a little bit of check-in, but then it's a work. So I do all my mushroom growing this way. So we do a kind of work teaching exchange. And I think, people coming and volunteering their help on projects it's massive. It has a massive impact, because the reality is, and we've brought it up in here, is that, if you want to tend the land in an agroecological way, it's very hard to make the numbers add up. And the more you then put pressure on what you're doing to make those numbers, the more likely it is that you're going to have to make decisions that you don't necessarily want to make. So I think, there's so many amazing land projects out there that welcome volunteers, and it's just like getting involved and bringing your gifts with you. That's what I would say.
I've got a response. We started running events at our garden, and I think what we realised after a while that we're trying to make a forest garden, and then the events would come along, and it's just me and my partner. It's just like what we needed to do to organise the event. Sort of started to take us away from our primary objective, and so that didn't kind of work for us. But now what we're doing is we've got long-going associations with Shift Bristol, which is a permaculture school, and so it's been going on long enough now that they come once a month during the summer and self-organise, like maybe 10 people, and have a bit of a holiday. They can use our natural swimming pond and things like that, and we've got sort of a cultural space with a stage and an amphitheatre, so they'll enjoy that in the evenings. And then they give us a bit of work, a couple of hours of work. And it's like an ecological system, we get what we need and they get what they need. And that's no sweat for us, because they self-organise. So what we're finding is having self-organising groups is what works, because they do the organisation rather than us. And that really works. So, but we're also thinking running cultural evenings and inviting musicians and so on and so forth to come along. So maybe, I don't know where you are based.
Well, our Music Unity group, all
Okay. Well, maybe we'll get your details, and we might have a place for you, and you can stay in our treehouse if you want. Yeah.
From an ecological point of view, I would something that I think I don't have any direct experience of, but I'm aware of something. I know what I don't know, and that is that soundscapes within natural environments is a growing sort of area of interest of ways of assessing the health of ecosystems, is to record the soundscapes. And some people have been doing this sort of very quietly in the background for years, but I think a lot of what we would term an ecologist would be coming at it from the point of view of knowing about ecosystems and plants and animals, and the ecology of the habitat, but they not, to be a specialist in the sound of that environment is very different. And so I've started to wonder if there's a place where people who have an ear for music and sound can come and support those more traditional knowledge-based ecological experts, if you like, or specialists, in bringing their skills to be able to hear what's going on in the environment. And so that is maybe something that you could think about. What can you bring to someone who has a very much of knowledge about the land, but maybe, we all talk about bird song and how beautiful it is to be away from roads and industrial sounds, but we don't really capture them or know that much about what they indicate for the habitat. So that's just an idea that is worth thinking about as well.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, we're at time now, but I'm just wondering, if people need to leave, obviously leave, but do you have energy for one more question? Slight side nod from Naboo there. Okay, we'll have one more question from Ed, and then we'll wrap up.
So the most interesting thing for me in this room has been, and I might be treading quite dangerous ground here because I might be making a lot of assumptions, but the distance that I sense between your world and you own this land, right? Between that world and the culture that's kind of on display from these folk over here, and I just sense a bit of distance there. And the thing that's interesting me most, and I feel maybe probably most urgent, is what is that distance about?
How would you feel if we said, well, we'll rewild these two fields?
Well, I don't know. But is that what you want to do?
Of course, really, isn't it? You can't do it, be everything to all people. You've got to kind of manage the fields, manage the land in different ways.
Yeah.
If we rewilded this, then we wouldn't have space for this.
I'm not. My question isn't coming from the place of like, I think the distance should be like you going over there. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm really interested, actually, in the choices that you make and why they're different. I don't want to criticise them one bit. I'm really interested in, are these kinds of things that you're hearing about here, things that you'd like to do, but for some reason that feels a bit mysterious in this space to me, they feel a bit more impossible to you because of your setup or because of your, I don't know.
Doing it in small parts, with, like creating hedge banks and planting new hedges. Several hundred yards of not just here, but farm down the road where maybe done quite a lot with that. We've also got field margins, where we don't mow it, but there's a certain amount of grant available for that. It's not basically the grants we get, you can't do it in place.
Right. And so you're saying there are things that you want to do, that you'd rather do, that you'd like to do, that you can't do, or ways that you'd like to go back to that you feel like you can't, or like where are you at with it? What you really want to do?
Possibly aspiring to the sitting on the cushion.
Yeah, I like fields and cows too, so I'm honestly, it wasn't, and I didn't want to single you out either, actually. It wasn't really about that.
But I suppose to wrap it up there, I mean, what you're pointing towards, Ed, you want to say something here? You know, that there's a kind of shared intention, the shared value system of being with, working on part of the land that is there, shared, is here in this space, and then the limitations that come about in terms of how we function within the structures that are put upon us, and, you know, the various different ways and approaches of meeting that, and the different outcomes that are needed for that. But there's certainly, I've felt it in this space, that is, there is a shared intention. It's not a kind of this or that. But you wanted to say something, Alex?
Yeah, I think it's really valuable you saying there's that distance and the shared intention as well. I think the distance for me is one of a cultural background. I grew up, I'm not from a land working family. I don't know what it's like to be on the land at that level. And so I feel like the distance, actually it's my responsibility to look at how I can come to you in this example, or learn from people that have that kind of experience, because I'm coming with some lenses that are maybe more head orientated, and part of what we need to learn is how this actually looks like in the field day to day, with the livestock, with the crops, with the climate, that some book learning can help us with, but actually it's what you carry and the experience we carry is really valuable. So it feels really important. I'm really glad that you two are here. And
We are first generation.
okay.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your noticing, I guess. I think it's one of the dangers of putting us up here. We've all come from different backgrounds or points of view. And I think it's about, we're representing a very small part of what we've brought with us today. And we could have been exchanged for another 5 people who would have had a completely different view. I guess the nature of this gathering is that we've come, you know, through contacts, or so we're maybe more likely to be doing something outside of the mainstream. But I think one of the things about the gap is just taking the time to hear ask those questions, and the question about community, the thing that I was going to say was also about just sitting down and listening to people's stories. You know, I think is asking, how did you get to where you are, and what motivates you to be there? And you know, some of that will be money, some of that will be background, some of that will be beliefs or ideology, you know, and everything in between. So it's actually just having a conversation with those people who own the piece of land near you or next door to you, and not actually going with an outcome, which in itself is a form of rewilding. Is not going with a set intention of, I'm going to go there and persuade them to come and do what I do. It's just, oh, where are you coming from? You know, and that's it. All you went is to just find out, you know, to hear them. And that maybe closes that gap slightly, because if you hear that person's personal story, then they realise they're not so far away from you. You know, you might be doing completely different things on your fields, metaphorically on your fields next door, but actually somewhere in between is something probably very much in common about why you're doing that and what it feels like inside for you. So, yeah, it's just hearing each other's stories and trying to work out whether there's anything in there that can be shared.
Thank you. That sounds like a good note to end on. You got something really snappy you want to add?
No, it's okay.
Oh, God, he's left us hanging now.
Yeah. Rose?
But I think we're going to wrap this up now, because we've gone over. But so I just want to give my appreciation to the people that have put themselves forward to sit on these seats and to speak in this way, and to all of the questions and comments and knowledge that's in the room here. So yeah, thank you very much.